Hey, Katie. We have The Clue of the Broken Locket. We are on chapter 14, The Cricket Clue. All three girls dashed into the living room. They looked horrified at the scene before them. The front door stood open. A huge rock lay on the floor, and beside it both Cecily and Nico lay unconscious. Bess gave a little scream as she and George ran forward to kneel beside the stricken couple. Nancy was torn momentarily between helping them and trying to find the rock thrower. She rushed from the cottage and gazed around. Two men were racing along the lakefront toward the lodge, and in a minute vanished from sight among the trees. "I bet they're the Driscoll brothers," Nancy murmured to herself. "I wish I'd had a better look. Well, I can't do anything about it now." She hurried back inside the cottage. For the first time, she realized exactly what had happened. The two assailants had carried the heavy rock up to the porch, quietly opened the door, and thrown their weapon with full force at the couple. Cecily and Nico had been seated on the small couch before the fireplace, their backs to the door. Fortunately, the rock had struck the couch, but the force of the blow had pitched the pair forward, and they had struck their heads on the edge of the hearth. "They might have fallen right into the fire," Nancy thought, shuddering. Bess and George were already giving Cecily and Nico first aid, and in a little while they revived. Both had bruises on their heads, but otherwise were not injured. They were thunderstruck to learn what had happened. "I think you need a police guard at this place," Nico said shakily. Cecily looked wan and upset, so she's kind of pale looking. Luckily there was a diversion at that moment. Bess cried out, "Oh, our hamburgers!" She dashed into the kitchen and presently announced that she had 3 very well done, somewhat burned hamburgers for sale. Nancy, Bess, and George temporarily had lost their appetites, but there was enough of the hot soup for everyone, and Bess served cups of it in the living room. As the group sat around sipping the soup, they discussed the mystery. None could think of any reason for the attack. Presently, Nico admitted to being very tired, and said he would drive back to Mrs. Hoskins for a good night's sleep. "I'll see you all in the morning. How about Cecily driving to Baltimore with me tomorrow, and you girls coming in Nancy's car? We can stop at my record company first." The plan was agreed upon. As Nico was about to leave, Cecily said, "I'll have to do something with Satin while we're away. Will you ask Mrs. Hoskins if she'll keep him?" Nico scooped up the beautiful black cat. "I'll take him right now. Good night, everybody." Nancy was the first one awake the next morning. She hurried into the kitchen, and by the time the others opened their eyes, the delicious aroma of broiling bacon reached them. The girls took a quick dip in the lake, then ate before dressing. By 9 o'clock they had locked the cottage and were on their way. While the others waited at Mrs. Hoskins, Nancy drove to the police headquarters and talked with Chief Stovall. She told of the many happenings in or near the cottage since the prowler had broken in. The chief frowned. "Last night's attack is certainly bad business. I'm sorry we've made no progress on catching the vandal. I take it you believe the same person, or persons, are responsible for both incidents. But this business about the phantom boat I still can't swallow. There must be a logical explanation for it." Nancy smiled. "The apparition is pretty weird, but it is also very lifelike." "I just don't see any sense to it," the officer said. "Granted, this phantom ship is man-made, as you say, but who would want to do it, and why?" "To scare people away from the lake." Chief Stovall shrugged. "Well, all right. I'll look into that, too," he promised. Then the young sleuth left. Nancy followed Nico's car all the way to Baltimore. When they reached the historic old city, she was glad the young musician was leading her to the tricky, narrow, one-way streets to the record company's office. Nico introduced the girls to the president, Mr. Carpenter, and he in turn introduced another man as Police Detective Morton. Nancy brought out the record she had purchased at the Misty Lake soda shop. She requested that before having it played, Mr. Carpenter bring in one of their own recordings of Nico's number. This was done, and it was played from beginning to end as everyone listened carefully. "It's a wonderful record," Bess said dreamily. "Thank you," Mr. Carpenter answered, smiling. We think so too, and evidently the public does. Nancy's record was now placed on the player. Again, everyone listened intently. For the first time, Nancy detected certain faint sounds on the disc which she had not noticed before. It sounded just like crickets in the background, she exclaimed when the music came to an end. Mr. Carpenter's jaw set grimly. There's no question but that this was pirated from ours. Now we have something concrete. We'll go after these thieves. How will you do it? Nico asked. Detective Morton spoke up. I'll try tracing them through the jobber, he said. Nancy gave Neil Raskin's name, explaining that the girls had tried unsuccessfully to see him. She suggested that the strange background noise on the record, which sounded like crickets, might be a clue, although a slight one, to the place where the records were being cut. I realize, Nancy added, that crickets are found throughout the country. Detective Morton smiled at her. Your suggestion may still be helpful, Miss Drew. At least it tells us the record was cut in a rural area where the sound of crickets could be plainly heard. And it must have been cut recently, since Nico's number came out last month. If you want to unearth any more good leads, please get in touch with me. Nancy promised to do so. The callers rose and said goodbye to Mr. Carpenter and the detective. The company president assured Nico everything would be worked out fairly, and he was glad to have proved to the young man that royalties were not being withheld from him. We'll start a suit against those pirates immediately, Mr. Carpenter said. I surely hope you do, Nico replied. Cecily and I need the money to get married. Mr. Carpenter congratulated the engaged couple and wished them luck. Maybe my engagement present to you will be a big fat royalty check. When he reached the street, Nico said he must go to the theater immediately for a rehearsal. He would see them after the show that evening. When the singer had left, Bess asked Nancy, What's next on our schedule? The girl detective said she thought they should locate the Kenneth Wayne home and see what they could find out. After getting directions from a policeman, Nancy drove there. The address they sought proved to be a modest apartment house. Nancy rang the bell marked Wayne, but there was no answer. How am I ever going to find out about these people? Cecily asked. Someone here must know them, Nancy said. She rang the bell of a Mrs. Rumsey on the first floor. The woman was very cooperative. She kept staring at Cecily as she replied to Nancy's questions. Mr. and Mrs. Wayne died about 3 years ago. Their 2 sons still rent the apartment, but both are in the Navy now and rarely come home. The woman went on. Also, there's a daughter named Susan. She was married in the old Wayne homestead up at Misty Lake about 4 years ago. She went out west to live and just seemed to disappear. Maybe her 2 brothers know something about her, but I never got to talk to them. Addressing herself to Cecily, Mrs. Rumsey added, I've seen wedding photos of Susan. She resembles you so closely it's startling. You 2 must be related. Cecily was so surprised that she did not comment. Nancy asked quickly, Mrs. Rumsey, does Susan have red hair? Oh, yes, lovely, too. Nancy and the others exchanged excited glances. Could Susan be the red-haired stranger at Misty Lake? Cecily smiled at the woman. I'm trying to find out some information from the Waynes. It's very important. If the Wayne brothers return within the next few days, will you ask them to get in touch with me at Mrs. Hoskins at Misty Lake Village? Otherwise, I hope they will contact Nico Van Dyke, the singer. Do you know him? Mrs. Rumsey asked. I love his records. Cecily blushed. We're engaged. Oh, you lucky girl, Mrs. Rumsey exclaimed. I wish you all the best. Cecily thanked her, then Nancy expressed her appreciation for the woman's help, and the 4 girls went off. They had lunch, then checked into the motel at which they had arranged to stay, and where Ned, Bert, and Dave would meet them. Soon after Nancy and the others had rested, showered, and dressed, the Emerson College youths arrived. All were grinning, obviously happy at seeing their favorite dates. Cecily was introduced to the 3 boys. I've always wanted to hear Nico in person, said Ned, a handsome, dark-haired, athletic youth. Bert was of medium height, husky and blond, while Dave was tall and rangy, with green eyes. Amid much gaiety, the 7 dined at a restaurant, where the boys were told of the mysteries Nancy was trying to solve. Later, when they reached the theater, they found a mob of people already there, most in their teens or early 20s. "It's a good thing we have reserved seats," Ned remarked. Inside the theater, the audience was shouting excitedly, and when the lights dimmed and the band came out, thunderous clapping started. By the time Nico Van Dyke appeared on the stage, there was a standing ovation turned around and there was a standing ovation with screams and yells. The young musician turned around and, smiling broadly, bowed several times. When the pandemonium did not lessen, he held up his hand for silence. Finally, the audience quieted down. "Your fiancé sure is popular," whispered Bess to Cecily, who beamed. Every number on the program drew wild acclaim, and after Nico had sung a second time, there was no holding down the teenagers. They kept up continuous applause, which was so loud that the last number on the program could hardly be heard above the din. "How is Nico ever going to get out of this place without being mobbed?" Nancy leaned over to ask Cecily. "A private car is always waiting for him, and he's rushed off in a hurry. We're to go backstage and see him after the performance." As the audience filed out, still in a delirious state, Cecily and her friends made their way to the door which led to the dressing rooms. A watchman unlocked it. The group enthusiastically praised Nico for his fine performance. He thanked them, but added wearily, "It was a terrific session, but getting out of here is a real problem." Everyone waited, hoping most of the audience would have left the sidewalk near the alley, but they were not to be cheated out of a close view of their favorite performer. "I'll just have to chance it," Nico said finally. "Tonight 2 cars are waiting. Some of us will go in the first, the rest in the second. We'll go to your motel first, girls, then decide what to do for the rest of the evening." As the guard opened the stage door, the uproar began again. Cecily shrank back. Inadvertently, Nancy was the first one to leave the building, with Nico directly behind her. He grabbed her arm and guided her through the mob toward the first car parked in the alley. The driver hopped out and quickly opened the rear door for Nancy and Nico. As soon as they were seated, Nico locked the doors and said to the driver, "Get us out of here!" The car started slowly forward. "Quick, Nancy, crouch down," the band leader advised, to keep the crowd from spotting them and stopping the car. The plan succeeded, and they finally reached the street. The driver turned right, and when they had gone a block, Nico and Nancy sat up, and the musician said, "Take us to the Stratford Motel." At the next corner, Nancy expected the driver to turn left. Instead, he went straight ahead. After 3 more crossings, she realized he was going far out of the way of the motel. She whispered this to Nico, who queried the driver, but the man merely said, "I know where I'm going." Suddenly, panic seized Nancy. She whispered to Nico, "Is he your regular driver?" "No," he answered. "Never gave it a thought. Why?" The young sleuth spoke directly into Nico's ear. "I'm afraid we're being kidnapped."